20 next week, and I thought I would give a little introduction to the law in order to kind of orient us around that. So that's what we're going to look at. So really today is, it's called "Oh, How I Love Your Law." It's a practical introduction for today's Christian. But it's that phrase I would like to have you kind of drill into your mind today is, "Oh, how I love your law." So when I was a kid going to Sunday school, like you kids are not going to get to go to Sunday school today. When I was going to Sunday school, I was taught that Jesus set me free from the law. And so we counted up over 600 laws that I don't have to obey anymore. And so the conversation went something like this. Look, Jamie, look at this law. This says here that you cannot eat pork, but you can eat pork, Jamie, because Jesus set you free from the law. And look over here at this law. This says you cannot work on the Sabbath, but you can work on the Sabbath because Jesus set you free from the law. And on and on and on and went. And it was sort of 600 laws that I didn't have to deal with because Jesus set me free. So I'm sure this is not what my Sunday school teachers intended. But it left me with the definite impression that God set up some pretty silly laws in the Old Testament and then had to send Jesus to clean up the mess that he had made. And so when I left the class, I left with the feeling that the law was basically bad. Now, from this, as I'm trying to paint for you a picture of what my Sunday school experience was like, you might get the picture that I went to one of those liberal, loosey-goosey, anything-goes sorts of churches. You know the ones I speak of. And that was definitely not the case. While we didn't worry about pork or certain days of the week, we made sure very carefully that we did not go to movies, we did not go to dances, and we really made sure that no one was drinking wine in the congregation. Okay? Now, I really have to think about that for a second, because isn't that interesting, right? On one hand, we got rid of the law, and on the other hand, we added to it. And so as I look back, it's sort of like, okay, we're somewhat lawless on one hand, but on the other hand, we're somewhat legalistic. And so, as you can imagine, I was somewhat confused. Now, as I look back on it, I think, at least a little bit, I can make some sense of what's going on. As our science textbooks tell us, nature abhors a vacuum. When we cut off the laws of God, I think that we feel the loss of it instinctively, and we start to set up rules for ourselves. Because everybody secretly does actually want rules to live by. If there are no rules, how do I know if I win the game? Now we may want to be like Calvin Ball. We get to make up our own rules, but we still want rules. So you might say it like this: we got to bring it down. Even a rebel without a cause has a code. You got to bring that down. God. Got it. Okay. Even a rebel without a cause has a code. So as I grew up and I started to study the Bible more seriously, this is what I started crashing into in my studies. There are all these verses. We've actually seen some of them already this morning. There's all these verses that celebrate God's law. Psalm 119, this is from our call to worship. Oh, how I love your law. It doesn't say just how do I love your word. It's actually how I love your law. It is my meditation day and night, from Psalm 1. Oh, how blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, nor stand in the path of sinners, nor sit in the seat of scoffers, but what? His delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he does meditate day and night. From the mouth of Jesus in Matthew chapter 5, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish these things, but to fulfill them. I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke of a letter will pass from the law until everything takes place. Well, I just had no idea what to do with these verses. I mean, do you? If I took them seriously, did that make me a legalist? I really didn't want to be a legalist. If I dismissed them as, an Old Testament thing, did that make me rebellious? And I just didn't know. And I share my story here because I'm not the only one who wrestles with this question. What do we do with the law of God? Many Christians today just have no idea, not just what to do about it, but even how to feel about it or how to think about it. Maybe even you here today are among those who are saying, yeah, I don't understand that either. In 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 8, we're told this: the law is good as long as one uses it lawfully. The law is good as long as someone uses it lawfully. So that's really the question. What's the right use of the law? How do we use the law lawfully? And that's what we're going to talk about today. Here's the big idea. When Christians understand God's law, we're set free to love it. When you understand it, you're set free to love it. And that's really my hope. Here's the application is that you would be able to actually say with Psalm 119, oh, how not just how I do your law or how I understand your law, but rather, oh, how I love. It has reached your affections, your heart. Oh, how I love your law. Well, we can't do that unless we understand it to some extent, so that you would be set free by your understanding to love the law. What does the law do for us? Here's the question. What does the law do for us that we should love it? And I'm going to name for you three things. First, the law reveals our true trouble like an x-ray machine. So when you think of the law, first thing you should think of is an x-ray machine, and it's revealing what your true trouble is. The second thing is the law protects us. If the law reveals, it also protects. It protects us from what? It protects us from outside evil like a loaded gun. So if it's an x-ray machine revealing something to you, it's also a loaded gun protecting you. The third thing that we'll look at, and this is really the thing I want to focus on for the most part, even though I won't give it, I'm not going to break up these points in such a way that you're going to feel like this is really the thing I want to focus on today. But this is the thing I really do want to focus on, which is this. It's not just an x-ray machine. It's not just a loaded gun. It's a treasure map. It's going to guide you to real flourishing. What does happy flourishing look like? What does really the good life look like? It looks like lawfulness. It's happiness. So it's an x-ray machine, it's a loaded gun, and it's a treasure map. It reveals, it protects, and it guides. So we're going to look at the first point. What does the law do that we should love it? Well, the first thing it does is it reveals our true trouble like an x-ray machine. The usual way we talk about the law of God is that it is a mirror. It shows you your face. If you have mud on your face and you look into the mirror, you will say, oh, I have mud on my face. I didn't know before, but now that I have looked into the mirror, I know. And so it is with the law, right? We think we're doing really well. We think like, I am really doing very well indeed. I am very righteous. I am very clean. And then we read, honor your father and mother. Suddenly we remember our disobedience, the fact that we roll our eyes, the fact that we like to the fact that we like to complain. We remember our disrespect and our disobedience, and suddenly, oh no, I've got mud on my face. So the law of God is like a mirror. But it goes deeper than that, doesn't it? A mirror goes how deep? Skin deep. It can show you your face. It can't really show you your heart. The power of God's law is that it doesn't just show us our face, it shows us our heart. So in this way, the law is probably better described as an x-ray machine. Matthew chapter 5, verse 27. Jesus says this, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust at her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So Jesus is quoting the law of Moses here, and after he quotes it, he's interpreting it. He's not saying, okay, Moses was no good, Moses didn't get it right, he was wrong. He's not saying that. He's telling us what Moses always meant. The law of God is not just about our actions, it's about our attitudes. The Old Testament knows that, the New Testament knows that. It's not just about our faces, it's about our hearts. Okay, now I have to think about this, because if that's what that's true, if it comes to honoring my parents, then my attitude counts. And we all know that we're really good at masking our attitudes. So there's times where we kind of feel like, yeah, I'm obeying, but I'm rolling my eyes, not on the outside, but just on the inside. Like the little kid who is told to sit down and sit down and sit down, and finally he does sit down, but he declares to his parents, I'm standing on the inside. So it's not just enough to obey, when I'm young, and it's not just enough to just take care of them when they're old. In order to truly honor my parents, I've got to think about my attitude and my heart, which means what? I have to be honestly patient with them. And I have to be honestly thankful for them. I have to honestly and truly love them from my heart. And if the law means that, then not only do I have mud on my face, I've got mud in my heart. Do you know why that's a good thing? To know that? Because when I look at the law of God, I actually know what's actually wrong with me. What's my true trouble here? Because we all wonder, right? We do something stupid. We do something mean. We do something selfish. And what do we say? When we finally realize what we've done? What is wrong with me? Do you not ask that in the middle of the night? Or when your wife says, do you see what you've done? What is wrong with me? Or your husband? Well, one popular answer for what is wrong with me is that we lack education. Right? What's wrong with me is I don't really understand what's truly good for me. Well, sometimes that's the case. But that doesn't explain, you'll experience this. It doesn't explain the times when I actually know what is good for me and I don't do it. Right? It's not actually that I didn't know that vegetables were good for me. It's that I didn't like them. I'm not ignorant, I'm lazy. I'm not ignorant, I got angry, right? Whatever it is. There's times where we actually know what the situation is, we actually know what is right, and we don't do it. So that is a little bit of a problem for the person who says, really what the real problem is education. Well, I got my degree and I still got problems. Well, then they can say, well, how about a lack of self-esteem? What's really wrong with me is that I'm compensating for my insecurities. Well, I do have insecurities and I do compensate for them. What bothers me is that I tend to act worse when I feel secure. That is, I get spoiled and I just start to take what I want. Well, maybe I'm just sort of like angry about some injustice that I've suffered a long time ago. Well, that's true too. I've experienced some injustices and I probably do carry some residual anger. It's still too simple, is it not? That is, I'm not just somebody who's experienced injustice from someone else. I'm also somebody who has caused injustice. And I know very well what it feels like to have things be unfair. I know how bad that feels, and I've been sometimes the one to do that to others. So what's wrong with me? And it's like, oh wow, the law of God actually tells me the truth. It actually gets to the heart of it. My problem is me. I'm a sinner, right? So it's from my heart, from the beginning of my life, it's like my heart has been bent out of shape. And so my biggest problem is not my health, it is not my education, it is not my self-esteem, it is not my parents, it is not my kids, it is not my spouse, it's not where I live, it's not how little money I make, it's not how much money I make. It's none of those things really. Those things may be problems, but they're not the real problem. The real problem is me. And it's the law that's got the guts to tell me that. So in a world filled with lousy answers, incomplete answers, it is a relief to actually know, like, you ever been to the doctor? Like, oh, I actually know what's wrong with me. That's really comforting. Why is that good? Because if you get the real diagnosis, if you really know what the real problem is, now you can move on to get the real cure. And what's the real cure? Well, counter to our culture, it's not actually a new book. It's not a new pill. It's really a new me. And so I need forgiveness, and I need washing, and I need a change that is deep. And since I'm the problem, I can't possibly give it to myself. It must be a change that I cannot give. And so now we're going to switch gears for a second. This is where the law will point us to Jesus, the Son of God. So if the law is a mirror or an x-ray that shows me my sin, you know what else the law does? It's a photograph of the face of Christ. You take the 10 Commandments and you compare them to the life of Jesus that we see in the Gospels, and they line up perfectly. He's got no mud on his face. He's got no mud in his heart. Well, I live so often with selfishness and with self-pity and all kinds of excuses of why I couldn't have done a certain thing. That's so often my heart. Now, when I look at the life of Jesus, his life in his heart is filled with grace and truth kindness, loving his neighbor, honoring his parents, and the list goes on. What I'm saying is that when we look at Jesus, we're actually seeing someone who fulfilled the law, and he's the only one who did. And so what I'm saying about loving the law is this: I have come to love the law because the law has showed me Jesus. He's driven me to Jesus. And so I know the real cure because I first knew the real problem. Isn't that wonderful? So the question is, do you? Or are you somehow trying to fix the problem yourself? We can do this in a couple ways. First, some of us do it by attacking the law. This is growingly popular. That is, look, he read the chart wrong. I hate that mirror. It makes me look fat. Right? That's the kind of stuff we say. We say, oh, yes, I am too good. And I want a second opinion. And we look at the law and we think, really the mirror was bent, it was dirty. And so the temptation for us, especially as modern people, is we defend ourselves by attacking the law. The problem was the standard. More often, we try to use the law to actually get better. Right? We see what's demanded. We see we've got mud on our face, and so what we do is we try harder. We make a list, we make a plan, we set up a schedule. And so, of course, this is like using a mirror like a washcloth. It's like confusing an x-ray for the actual medicine. Right? That's not what these tools are for. What do these tools do? These tools are awesome at revealing. They're not good at fixing. Paul says this in Romans chapter 3. Listen to it. I'll read it slowly. By the works of the law, no flesh will be justified in his sight. For through the law comes the knowledge of sin. But now, apart from the law, the righteousness of God has been manifested, revealed, being witnessed by the law and the prophets, even the righteousness of God through faith in Christ Jesus for all those who believe. This is the first use of the law. By the law comes the knowledge of sin. It reveals the problem and then points you to Jesus. And so if you were to say, why should I love the law? I don't like those x-ray machines. I don't like the mirrors that make me look bad. You would say, it shows you your problem so you can actually know what the true cure is. And isn't that a good start? That's the first use of the law. By it comes the knowledge of sin. It's an x-ray machine. It reveals to us our true problem. Second point, what else does the law do that I should love it? It protects me from outside evil. So let's think about laws for a second, about how laws work in our society. So now we're not talking about the law of God. Now we're talking about the laws of Pittsfield, the laws of Maine, the laws of the United States. Okay, so let's think about speed limits. I don't usually like to think about speed limits because I don't usually like to obey them. But for the sake of the illustration, let's think about them anyway. So say I'm driving 50 miles an hour down Main Street, Pittsfield, which is posted what? What? Hey, somebody knows. I try not to know, so if I get pulled over, it's like, I'm not, what? I didn't see it. Yeah, see? You should have probably known this before you voted for me. So I'm driving 50 miles an hour down Main Street, Pittsfield, and a policeman sees me. What's he going to do? Pull me over. Now, what if I don't like to get pulled over? I don't like to get pulled over. What if I decide, you know what? I'm going to make a scene. What's he going to do? He's going to arrest me. Well, I don't like to get arrested. I don't want to get arrested, so what am I going to do? What if I'm going to decide to fight him? What's he going to do? Shoot me. Right? Okay. He's going to tase me. Yeah. All right. Well, my illustration says loaded guns, so we're staying with guns. This is how the law works, right? All law is real authority backed by real force. Real authority backed by real force. So it doesn't really matter how I feel about it, right? It doesn't really matter how much I like to speed, and it doesn't really matter how much I don't like being pulled over. The law is a real authority backed by real force, and so it is with the law of God. God's law is a real authority backed by real force. The first use of the law is that it reveals our sin. The second use of the law is that it restrains our sin. It reveals, but it also restrains. So in 1 Timothy, this is the verse right after the one I already read to you in 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 8, which says that if the law is used lawfully, it's good as long as it's used lawfully. In verse 9, it says this: the law is not made for a righteous person, but for those who are lawless and rebellious, for the ungodly and sinners, for the unholy and profane, for those who kill their fathers or mothers, for murderers and immoral men and homosexuals and kidnappers and liars and perjurers and whatever else is contrary to sound teaching. What have we already seen? In one sense, we all fall into this category, right? In one sense, we're all lawless. But there is a distinction to be made here. Not everyone is completely lawless. That is, here's the important difference. Some people care that they're sinners, and some people do not. That is, some of us, even though we've, even people out there, you look at them and you say, like, well, this is somebody who doesn't really know the Lord, who doesn't really regard the Bible as anything, and yet it bothers them. It keeps them up at night if they think they've hurt somebody. That's true. That's true for Christians, and that's true for non-Christians. There are people out there that they know they're sinners, and yet it bothers them. It worries them. It keeps them up at night. And some people are not like that. They are not worried. They are not bothered. They really don't care. And so if somebody's in that position, that is, I'm going to speed, and no one's going to tell me what to do, that kind of mentality, then for them the law becomes a loaded gun. Here's a scene from Revelation chapter 20. Try to picture this scene. Then I saw a great white throne and him who sat upon it, from whose presence earth and heaven fled away, and no place was found for them. And I saw the dead, and great, small, standing before the throne, and books were opened, and another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged from the things which were written in the books according to their deeds. And the sea gave up the dead which were in it, and death and Hades gave up the dead which were in them. And they were judged, every one of them, according to their deeds. And then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. And if anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. A passage like this can shut modern people down, right? We say, what are you trying to do, scare me? I got to answer kind of yes and no. That is, I'm not trying to manipulate you through fear, but at the same time, isn't it good to be scared by scary things? Or rather this, isn't it good? Sometimes fear can make us care where we didn't care before. Remember Ebenezer Scrooge? Remember the three ghosts that come to Ebenezer Scrooge in the Christmas Carol? What's the ghost that finally breaks through? It's the third one. And he has to show him his death. And he says, he doesn't, there's all these other things that he's missed out. There's all these hopes that he's been given. And it's not until the third one he goes, okay, I'll change. It's good to be scared at scary things because it can make us otherwise, that we wouldn't otherwise care, now we care. And so there is coming a day when all of us will face God's judgment. And we will be judged. And what does it say? According to our deeds. That is what we did and what we did not do. And the sea will not protect us, and death will not exempt us. This is coming, and it's a moment of truth, and we will all face it. And so even if you don't care about God's law, you might just be willing to obey it out of natural self-interest. Just as I might want to speed, and I don't want to get arrested, so may you want to disregard your parents, but you don't want to get judged. And this is the second use of the law. The idea is that it threatens punishment. It's like a loaded gun. It's like threatening punishment, and so it restrains evil. Well, how am I doing? All right, I'm trying to tell you, here, you should really love the law. And the first things I've told you is that first, that God's law does what? It reveals your sin. And the second thing is actually threatens to punish you. And you might be sitting there saying, what's there to love in all of that? I think you just told me that the law tells me, first of all, I'm bad, and the second thing it tells me is that I can't have any fun. Think about it more deeply. The law does not restrain just your sin, it restrains the sin of others. Evil is real. Evil is not just a word that people made up in order to have control over other people. Evil is real. Bad guys are real. And so even as you have held back sometimes, all of us will have had some moment of, I really want to do this, but I know I have to answer to God for it. All of us will have had some moment like that. So even as you may have had this experience where you're holding back from doing something terrible because you didn't really want to have to answer to God for it, so have lots of other people had that experience. And so however bad you think society is now, it would be much worse without the law of God. What this means is that the law of God has been protecting you, sometimes silently, all your life, like a thin blue line. The first use of the law is it reveals our sin, and the second use of it is that it restrains evil. Why should I be thankful for it? It protects me, and it reveals to me my real problem and shows me the true cure. Now we're going to move to the third point, which I've already said is my real emphasis for all this. What we just talked about before was what we call the negative side of the law. Now we're going to talk about the positive side of the law. The law guides us to happy flourishing like a treasure map. If the law is an X-ray machine and it's a loaded gun, well, it's also a treasure map. It guides us to the good life. Now, as I think back on my Sunday school experience, I realized that it was really this side of the law that was never mentioned. Right? I knew all about how the law revealed my sin, and I knew all about how the law was going to judge me, but I knew almost nothing, as I look back on it, probably nothing, about how the law guides me in the paths of righteousness, how the law brings me to quiet waters and green pastures. I didn't know anything about the law, how that was actually the good life. I had no idea that it would make me happy. So as an introduction into Exodus 20, as we move there next week, let's remember what happened last week, which we saw in Exodus 19. What does God say when he invites Israel into this promise, his covenant, from Exodus 19, verse 5? You might remember it. You might have it memorized, or you could hear me read it. Now then, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession among all the peoples. And for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Now, what did we look at last week? Remember what we noted? This is not an invitation into salvation. In terms of the story, salvation has already happened. It's already taken place. How do we know that? God has already taken them out of Egypt. Already he has carried them out, remember the phrase, on eagle's wings. And so the law is not an invitation into salvation. Actually, the law takes place because salvation has already taken place. The law is an invitation, therefore, into mission. If Israel obeys the law, she gets to be a kingdom of priests. Remember, we talked about what does a priest do? He gets to represent God to the people, and the people back to God. And here's a whole nation getting to do that for the whole world. It's missional. They will be what? A special treasure. The best nation in the world. Really, the invitation is like, here's the good life. How did Israel do? Have you read how the story plays out? Again and again, whenever we see the promises of God and then we see the behavior of Israel, we have to say, wow, God was faithful, and Israel did what? Was unfaithful. They broke the promise. They said, yes, everything you say, we will do. And then everything he said, they didn't do. Again and again, that's how it plays. We actually, in our Wednesday night studies, we're looking at the book of Judges, which is sort of like the great swirly down, down, down. Everyone feels like they're in the middle of being flushed down the toilet when they're looking at the book of Judges, right? It's like, wow, it's not going well. What that means is not only did they not obey, they didn't fulfill their mission. Why? Well, you've heard Bill say this a few weeks ago. It's easier to get them out of Egypt than get Egypt out of them. That is, they needed more than a geographical change. They needed more than a sociological change. They needed the Spirit of God. And so when we come to the New Testament, what do we see? We see Jesus not only forgiving us for our lawlessness, but also sending us the Spirit so we can become lawful. So when we hear this from 1 Peter, this is what he says to us: but you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, so that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who has called you out of darkness and into his marvelous light. That's the promise of Israel being very clearly declared and presented to the church. So that what? We're filled with hope. Why? Because in the Spirit, we can actually fulfill the mission that they didn't fulfill. So here's the big picture. When we first come to the law, it condemns us. It shows us that we have mud on our faces and in our hearts. And it's a hard truth, but at the same time, it's at least good to know what is true. And it drives us to Jesus. Then, once we come to Jesus, a change happens. This is something we celebrate here, right? We're born again, a new creation. We're filled with the Holy Spirit. And because we're filled with the Holy Spirit, our relationship to the law changes. Before, the law was demanding things from me I didn't want to do, like, speeding. And now it's demanding things I really do want to do. It's like growing up. So kids, this is actually true. When your parents were little, they didn't want to make their bed either. And they didn't want to do the dishes. And they didn't want to do their chores. Now they actually want the dishes done, and they want the house to be tidy. I don't know if you know that, but at one point, they felt like you do when you're telling them to do your stuff. They felt the same way. Now, some of them, this may be a conversation on the way home. Some of them may still feel like they don't like a tidy house, but most of us, what ends up happening is there's a change. We're kids, we think like kids, we act like kids, and we're like, I don't know, I just throw food everywhere. And then we grow up and we're like, I don't want food everywhere. That's disgusting. No kid in their right mind wants to wash dishes. No kid in their right mind wants to make the bed. They want to go outside and play. Or in more modern culture, they want to stay inside and play. That's a different conversation. When they grow up, though, we actually want the house to be clean. Why? Because they've changed. They've grown up. That's actually how the law is described. The law was for children, and now that we're grown up, it's not that we get rid of the law. It's that we can actually do it. You don't need a law. I don't need a rule in my house saying, James, you should probably wash the floor every once in a while. That's what my wife is. No, it's actually that I want. It's actually that I actually would like it to be clean. Okay. In the same way, before we had the Spirit, when we saw the law, we were like, oh, we groaned under it. And now we have a phrase that fits pretty well with this in our modern day. Now we see the law, and what do we say? Don't threaten me with a good time. With a good time. Paul says this in Romans chapter 8. For what the law could not do, weak as it was through the flesh, God did, sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh as an offering for sin. He condemned sin in the flesh so that the requirement of the law might be fulfilled in us. This is not Jesus fulfilling the law for us. The scripture does speak that way. This is a different thing that's going on. This is the law of God is actually now being fulfilled in us, who do not walk according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. So then the goal of salvation is not that now, oh my goodness, isn't it wonderful? I've been set free from those 600 silly laws. The idea is not that we're being set free from the law or that we're being set free from having to obey the law. That it is now that we're actually set free to obey the law. And so in the flesh, the issue is that we couldn't obey it. I was still a kid. But in the Spirit, as I've matured and as you've matured more and more, we don't obey it fully, but more and more we can. And so again, we don't say as Christians, woo, sure glad we don't have to obey those laws. Sure glad I don't have to worry about them. Now, in case if you're hearing this and you think, oh no, what's going on? Is the next sermon going to be about how I can't eat bacon? Like, in case you're wondering about that, please don't be afraid. The way that the New Testament deals with the law, it's that the way that we obey the law changes. It passes through the cross and it changes. But we still obey it. But we obey it in a different way. In the Spirit, think about this. This is how to connect the dots from the Old Testament to the New Testament. What's being offered to the people of Israel as they're coming into Sinai, and God's offering this mission to them, and they can't do it. And then here it is, we're receiving the same promise and the same invitation, and now we've been given the Spirit so we can actually fulfill the mission. That's the benefit of the New Testament. That's the benefit of the Spirit of God and the cross of Christ. So in the next 10 weeks, we're going to be studying the next 10 commandments. And so you can do the math, I bet, on that. One commandment a week from Exodus 20. And as we go, what we're going to do is we're going to see how the law reveals our sin, and we're going to see how it restrains evil. But mostly what we're going to focus in on how this is the good life. When we obey the law, we're working with the grain of how God built the world. And so, as moderns, we tend to think of all law as arbitrary. Like, it's just really some kind of power thing. Somebody got power, now they're going to give me a law because they just want to flex their muscles, right? Whenever we see a law, we tend to think of it as some arbitrary abuse of power. That is not ever how the law of God is. God's law is not arbitrary. It's kind. God's law is kind. He's helping us to know how things work. So when he says, honor your father and your mother, honor your parents, it's kind of like telling us the law of gravity. What goes up must come down. So when we obey God's law, and this is something I couldn't have known until I began to practice these things in my own life, it's really good. When we begin to obey the law, there's things begin to make sense that didn't make sense. Things start to go well that forever were being complicated and hard before. That is to say, when we begin to actually obey the law, because we can now, things in our lives go better. Our family, our work, our friendships, our stresses, our sanity, our money, even our health. And it's not just because we tend to think if I obey, God will bless me. We kind of do that thing. And that there is truth in that. But it's not just that God is somehow blessing us for it. It's also that we're now finally living with the way God made things. We're working with the grain. And when you realize this, and not just when you get clicks in your head, but rather when you begin to experience it firsthand, then suddenly it's actually pretty easy to say with the psalmist, oh, how I love your law. You're guiding me into green pastures. This is the good life. Psalm 1 will not just be some chapter in the Bible. Psalm 1 will be your testimony. How blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, nor stand in the path of sinners, nor sit in the seat of scoffers. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night. He will be like a tree, firmly planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in its season, or in due season. And its leaf does not wither, and whatever he does, he prospers. That's what the law does for us. It helps us to prosper. I hope you begin to get a sense and a vision of what the law of God can be for us. It's like an X-ray. It reveals. It's like a loaded gun. It protects. It's like a treasure map. It guides. Now, as a response to that, I would like to sing, and then we're going to move right into into communion, and Bill's going to lead that. And so I'm going to lead us into the doxology, which is goes like this if you don't know it. Praise God from